For years, Kaliningrad was supposed to be Vladimir Putin's unbeatable Western fortress, Russia's forward military base placed deep inside the European Union, a geopolitical clenched fist pointed straight at NATO, the Baltic fleet, missile systems, radar equipment, shipyards, military factories. It was shown as a symbol of permanence, proof that Russia's expansion westward was not just a battlefield move, but a permanent historical fact. Putin promised this region stability, prosperity, security, and victory. And no bonus shields your children from instability. A young engineer looks at the fate of that 40-year-old accountant laid off for 7 months and makes a cold calculation. If she isn't safe, I won't be either. And so they leave. Not for Moscow, not for St. Petersburg. They leave for Poland, Lithuania, Germany, and NATO countries. This is the deepest humiliation for Putin's narrative. The Russian people are not fleeing Western aggression. They are fleeing into the West to escape the future he created. Independent demographic analysis estimates that since the war began in 2022, Kaliningrad has lost between 100,000 and 150,000 people, up to 15% of its population in just 3 years. For a region built around military and industrial precision, this is not just population decline. It is structural amputation. And where are they going? Gdansk, Poland has quietly become a new hub for Russian IT specialists and entrepreneurs fleeing Kaliningrad. Vilnius, Lithuania, now hosts journalists, analysts, and political refugees who once worked inside Russia's system. Germany, Kaliningrad's former historical owner, is absorbing families with European ancestry and highly specialized professionals. The Kremlin calls this temporary travel. Reality calls it the longest silent evacuation Putin has ever overseen. And what remains behind? Retirees, civil servants, and those too poor or too trapped to leave. Which brings us to the next layer of collapse. If unemployment shattered household stability and brain drain began bleeding the region of its future, the next phase of Kaliningrad's collapse moved directly into its economic bloodstream. Logistics. For a modern industrial region surrounded entirely by NATO territory, logistics is not a technical detail. It is oxygen, and that oxygen is now being slowly cut off. Kaliningrad is not connected to mainland Russia by land. Every rail line, every highway, every commercial artery must pass through Lithuania. For decades, this dependence was treated by Moscow as an inconvenience, not a strategic vulnerability. That assumption has now collapsed. Since 2022, transit restrictions, inspection regimes, and sanctions enforcement have torn apart the region's import backbone. Steel, construction materials, industrial machinery, coal, high-technology components, all of it slowed, restricted, or made brutally expensive. Economists inside the region estimate that 40 to 50% of Kaliningrad's imports have effectively been choked off. The Kremlin tried to compensate by rerouting supply through maritime shipping, but sea routes are slower, less predictable, and catastrophically more expensive. The impact is visible in cold numbers. Industrial production in the region has fallen by nearly 25%. Entire plants have suspended operations. Even large furniture manufacturers and metal processors have quietly shifted to partial shutdowns. And then comes the cement figure, a statistic so extreme it barely seems real. Before the war, shipping a truckload of cement into Kaliningrad cost roughly 70,000 rubles. Today, the same shipment costs over 420,000 rubles. 6 times more expensive, 6 times less profitable. 6 times more layoffs. Construction firms have collapsed. Industrial maintenance projects have been frozen. Infrastructure decay accelerates because the materials required to halt it are now priced beyond reach. In transport alone, an industry employing up to 18,000 people in the region, nearly half of all companies currently report having no cargo at all, no loads to carry, no contracts to fulfill. No revenue stream. Kaliningrad, despite its heavy military presence, is now an economic island with collapsing bridges. And this is not just a commercial problem. It is a strategic nightmare. The Baltic fortress with a single lifeline. In military doctrine, a fortress surrounded by hostile territory must never depend on that territory for survival. Yet Kaliningrad depends entirely on Lithuanian transit for fuel, construction material, and industrial supply. Sociological and economic studies now show that the region's economy is heavily import-dependent and structurally fragile during crisis conditions, which means that with a single political decision from Vilnius, the economic heart of Russia's western stronghold could be stopped. That reality was no longer theoretical when Lithuania's foreign minister openly stated that transit through Kaliningrad could be fully suspended on national security grounds with one order, one signature. The consequences would be immediate. What investor puts money into a region that could be economically isolated overnight? What family stays when basic goods might disappear from shelves within weeks? This is why the shadow of blockade accelerates migration faster than any salary increase ever could. Young professionals do not flee because of poverty. They flee because they see a future shaped by vulnerability, uncertainty, and geopolitical hostage status. Kaliningrad is not fortified. It is exposed, and the people who understand systems best, engineers, its specialists, logistics experts, are the first to escape. This is not panic behavior. This is rational risk management, the hidden turn toward forced labor. Now we move into the darkest phase of the story. When economies collapse in authoritarian states, governments do not retreat. They reassign the population. With civilian industries failing and unemployment rising at catastrophic speed, the Kremlin's remaining solution is not economic revival. It is compulsory militarization of labor. Keats. The logic is brutal and simple. If people cannot find jobs, the state will give them one. Factories once assembling Western vehicles are now being quietly converted into tank repair hubs, drone assembly workshops, ammunition packaging lines, and military logistics centers. Market ownership does not matter anymore. Private firms are folded into state contracts through coercion. Profitability becomes irrelevant. Employment figures become propaganda assets. For unemployed women, the very accountants and managers now losing their livelihoods, the solution is equally relentless. Under banners of national service, they can be forced into military hospital logistics, uniform manufacturing lines, camouflage net production, depot administration, low pay, long hours, no choice. And for unemployed young men, the message is unspoken but undeniable. If the economy cannot absorb you, the army will. The economic collapse in Kaliningrad is producing fresh manpower for the war. Whether society consented or not, hunger becomes the most loyal recruiter the Kremlin has ever had. This is not labor policy. This is coercion disguised as patriotism. The psychology of a closed island. Once populations realize they are becoming trapped, psychology shifts faster than economics. The next move on Putin's chessboard is already visible in outline, restricting exit itself. In the Kremlin's worldview, freedom of movement is no longer a civil right. It is a security threat. Every engineer leaving Kaliningrad is seen not only as economic leakage, but as a potential intelligence risk. And so the most feared possibility begins to take shape, a return of the exit visa, resurrected under modern mobilization law. Passports could be confiscated under strategic personnel rules. Men of military age could be blocked from leaving. Doctors, IT specialists, and technical workers could be redesignated as critical infrastructure assets. Kaliningrad would become what it physically already resembles, an open-air prison inside NATO territory. The psychological impact would be devastating. People would no longer dream of prosperity. They would dream only of escape. And escape, once forbidden, becomes an obsession. History is painfully consistent on this point. At this moment, Kaliningrad stands at a fork in the road. One path leads to economic collapse with open borders and silent evacuation. The other leads to enforced isolation, forced labor, and permanent militarization. Neither path ends in stability, only in transformation, and not the kind Putin promised. At this stage, Kaliningrad no longer looks like a stronghold. It looks like an experiment in how long a modern European population can be held in economic suspension, political isolation, and strategic uncertainty before the idea of stability becomes meaningless. Because this is what remains now of the promise that once defined this region, not prosperity, not security, not victory, only management of decline. The political choice confronting the Kremlin is no longer whether Kaliningrad will change. It is only how brutal that change will be. The North Koreanization scenario. If mass migration accelerates and logistics vulnerability deepens, the Kremlin's most likely response is not reform. It is containment through isolation. This is where the phrase whispered increasingly often by analysts becomes relevant: North Koreanization. A closed enclave, permanent mobilization economy, travel restrictions, information control, total dependence on state distribution. In this model, Kaliningrad stops being an economic region and becomes a forward military warehouse filled with civilians. Private enterprise is gradually absorbed into defense contracts. Consumer markets shrink into ration supply networks. Education is reshaped around military utility. Public services become tools of surveillance rather than support. And, most critically, hope becomes a liability. For Putin, this is not ideological fantasy. It is strategic logic. If prosperity cannot hold the population in place, coercion will. If wages cannot secure loyalty, fear will. But here is the historical trap. No region that crosses this threshold ever returns intact. Because once innovation dies, it does not quietly reboot. And Kaliningrad is already bleeding innovation, the technological collapse behind the military facade. On paper, Kaliningrad still hosts some of Russia's most advanced Western military assets: Baltic fleet command centers, missile systems, radar arrays, shipyards, mechanical engineering plants. But no advanced system functions without people who understand how to maintain it. And those people are leaving quietly, relentlessly. Every engineer who crosses into Poland takes with him a decade of training. Every IT specialist who relocates to Lithuania removes thousands of micro-decisions from Russia's strategic brain. Every logistics expert who moves to Germany takes a map of efficiencies with them. This is not symbolic loss. It is operational decay. Independent technical assessments now openly state that maintenance cycles for critical military systems in the region have already begun slipping. Spare parts arrive slower. Diagnostic teams are understaffed. Firmware updates stall. Calibration schedules lag. In peacetime, this creates inefficiency. In wartime, it creates failure. Complex defense systems do not collapse with explosions. They collapse with missed updates and untrained replacements. Technological asymmetry is no longer just a battlefield phenomenon. It has migrated into Russia's home front, the strategic irony of dependence. For decades, the Kremlin cultivated an image of Kaliningrad as a self-sufficient fortress, a Western bastion immune to foreign pressure. In reality, it is one of the most dependent regions in the entire Russian Federation. Fuel, construction materials, industrial components, consumer goods, medical equipment, all of it passes through NATO territory. Kaliningrad does not face NATO from behind walls. It lives inside NATO supply perimeter. This is not a defensive advantage. It is the deepest strategic irony of Putin's geopolitical vision. The very region meant to intimidate the West is economically hostage to it. And the people living there understand this far better than those speaking about it in Moscow, which is why migration feels to them not like betrayal, but like escape from vulnerability, the psychological breaking point. Repression can hold bodies in place, but it cannot repair broken belief. The most dangerous shift underway in Kaliningrad is not material. It is mental. People no longer debate politics. They debate escape routes. They do not ask, will things improve? They ask, how long before they close the exits? Once a population begins thinking in those terms, the social contract has already dissolved. Surveys and informal polling inside the region now reveal something openly unprecedented for a former Kremlin stronghold. More than 1 in 5 adults personally knows someone who has already left. Migration has become contagious, not ideologically, but psychologically. And that contagion does not respond to propaganda. It responds only to control, which is why coercion is becoming inevitable. Unemployment as a military pipeline. In the Kremlin's remaining calculus, unemployment is no longer an economic indicator. It is a recruitment pool. For young men without income, the army offers guaranteed food, guaranteed housing, guaranteed pay, and a narrative of meaning. Hunger becomes command. Desperation becomes discipline. For women over 40 who once managed ledgers and budgets, unemployment becomes forced service under civilian military integration laws. This is not mobilization as emergency. This is mobilization as economic policy. But every society that has walked this path eventually discovers the same truth. You can force bodies into uniforms, but you cannot force belief into hearts. And armies without belief do not endure pressure well. The final strategic paradox. From a distance, Kaliningrad still appears to be a fortress. On satellite images, missile arrays still shine. On official maps, fleet markings still dominate the coast. On propaganda broadcasts, the enclave still stands unshaken, but beneath that surface, the foundations are disintegrating. Population decline, labor collapse, technological decay, supply chain vulnerability, psychological exhaustion, strategic dependence on adversaries. None of these produce dramatic footage. They do something more destructive. They hollow power out from the inside. Empires rarely fall when enemies storm their gates. They fall when the systems inside can no longer support the load of their own weight. What this means for Putin's power. Kaliningrad was meant to be proof that Putin could redraw Europe's borders and hold them indefinitely. Instead, it is becoming proof of something else, that military power without economic viability becomes performative. That territorial control without population confidence becomes theatrical. That fear without belief becomes brittle. If Kaliningrad fractures not militarily but socially and economically, the lesson will echo far beyond the Baltic coast. It will demonstrate that even Russia's most fortified showcase region cannot survive prolonged isolation under authoritarian management. And if stability fails here, it fails everywhere. The quiet ending. What is happening in Kaliningrad right now is not just an economic recession. It is the slow suffocation of a political project. A place meant to symbolize permanence is becoming a symbol of artificial survival. A region meant to embody forward power is now slowly being transformed into a closed, subsidized, militarized dependency. Putin can seal the borders. He can redirect factories. He can conscript labor. He can suppress statistics. But he cannot rebuild what has already quietly escaped: trust, talent, and belief. And once those leave, no wall is high enough to bring them back.